Hi everybody, I'm Allison and I'm a senior design manager at Zendesk. I've been working in design systems since 2013 and I've loved every minute of it. I'd like to also introduce you to my little sister Devin. Devin was born with a rare brain condition and she also lived with epilepsy and cerebral palsy. In our house, we had tons of accessibility devices littered everywhere. Wheelchairs, her hospital bed, lifts, communication devices like her Dynavox or her big red switches. When we were little, when I was 8 and she was 3, my family went to Disney World. And it was the first time that I really came into contact with accessibility in practice. Disney was a masterclass in how to do accessibility right. They had the same sorts of waiting experiences for people who were in wheelchairs. And when we took pictures with the characters, they bent down to make sure that Devin and them were on the same eye level. Not every experience since then has been as good. Anytime we would go to a restaurant, sometimes we would have to go around the back and use their ramp to get Devin into the restaurant. But really, it was just their smelly loading dock. Lots of people would treat Devin like she wasn't in the room, especially her doctors. And one time, the TSA even asked her to get out of her wheelchair and walk through security at an airport, even though my sister was never able to stand or even sit without assistance. But the memories that last the longest and make the deepest marks are the ones that we made with Devin and with the people who loved her and cared for her the same way that I did. There's a simple dignity in treating someone who's different as an equal, deserving of the same love and experiences that everybody else is. Devin's life inspired me to include accessibility in my design practice. And at Zendesk, where I work on the garden design system, we've pinned our feather on accessibility. So what is accessibility? Well, it's the practice of making an environment, whether physical or digital, usable for people who depend on assistive technology, whether that's glasses, a screen reader, or a wheelchair. It's also sometimes abbreviated as A11Y, which is what I hope you'll become after this talk, an ally. Now, accessibility sometimes brings up lots of negative thoughts around rules and guidelines, constraints, or even laws. But really, accessibility is about people. Now, usually when we're talking about accessibility in the digital world, we start thinking about people who are blind and how they might use a medium that's inherently visual. The word accessibility sometimes also brings up thoughts of wheelchairs, seeing eye dogs, and folks who have the observable markers of a disability. Those things can make people into others. It can create an unnecessary us versus them mentality. Now, a disability is a physical or mental condition that limits a person's movements, their senses, or their activities. It can affect vision, hearing, verbal skills, motor function, and cognitive function. Now, of course, we don't want to systematically make folks with disabilities into others. To do that, we have to recognize that people with disabilities not only exist, but that their lives are not so different from ours. Our understanding of disability has evolved over the years. Back in the 1980s, the World Health Organization defined disability only in terms of a personal attribute framed in the context of health. And it was almost entirely negative in terms of restrictions, a lack of ability, and it even compared disability to normal human abilities, which is really upsetting if you think about it. Today, we understand that disability is still related to health, but what it really is a mismatch between environment that someone's in and that person's abilities. It recognizes that disability is a complex phenomenon that's at the intersection of an individual and how they exist in society. Physical, cognitive, and social exclusion is the result of those mismatched interactions. Lots of people have disabilities, all ages, all races, all genders, and all classes. Not all disabilities are visible or what we've been taught they look like. Take aging. These are my grandparents on their wedding day, quite the handsome couple. And this was them on my wedding day. Now, aging itself is not a disability, but it does cause disabilities. Our vision gets worse. Bad knees can make us slower on our feet or even wheelchair bound. Sometimes our memory deteriorates. When we get older, we're more easily fatigued, and that can limit our movement or our cognitive ability. And that's just the normal stuff. I think that at some point, we're probably all going to need accessible technology. But if you don't like thinking about growing older, you can think about disability in the way that Microsoft defines it in their inclusive design methodology. They say that disabilities can be situational, like holding a baby in one hand and trying to use your phone in the other. Temporary, like if you broke your wrist and it's in a cast. Or permanent, maybe in the case of a veteran who's come back home missing a limb. I think probably all of us have experienced this or something like this. Thank you, Johnny Ive. Our technology can also cause situational disabilities, whether your mouse dies and you suddenly become a keyboard-only user, or maybe you have a bad monitor that washes out colors and makes it difficult to read, or maybe you've got a slow 3G mobile plan. We've all experienced these sorts of things, whether regularly, day to day, or just as one-offs every once in a while. People with accessibility needs are already using our products, and it's really important that we can recognize that. It's also important to recognize that most of the people who have accessibility needs already using our products might not even have what we would typically think of as a disability. I think it's important to remember that a lot of the devices that we use every day were actually originally intended for accessibility. Remote controls allowed people to just stay seated instead of having to get up and operate small buttons on a television. OXO's entire brand premise is that their kitchen gadgets are easier to use for people with dexterity issues stemming from arthritis. But they're easier for everybody to use, and that's why that company is so successful. Even something as mundane as a sidewalk cutout was originally intended for wheelchairs and people who have trouble taking stairs. But it's great for everybody, and it not only makes it easier to walk around a city, but it also helps us understand when the curb is coming up, so we don't walk into traffic. All of these are examples of everyone benefiting from accessibility. And I think because of that, we need to practice accessibility more intentionally. Inclusion goes beyond accessibility, and it seeks to make things that are not just usable, but friendly, welcoming, even delightful to anyone that uses them. Now, when most people get started on their digital accessibility journey, they start with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which are put out by the W3C, the standards making body for the internet. These guidelines are a natural starting place, and they're pretty good. They break accessibility down into 4 pillars. Perceivable, meaning that the content or product that you put out in the world cannot be invisible to the way that your users might sense it, whether that's visual or through their hearing. It needs to be operable, meaning that anyone can use your product as intended. And it needs to be understandable, meaning that people can expect your product to work in predictable ways, that it's not hard to use. And finally, it needs to be robust, accessed by a wide range of technologies, new and old browsers alike, including assistive technologies. Now, when you follow these guidelines properly, you'll end up with a product that is fully accessible by machines, by the assistive technology. But it's important to remember that while following these guidelines is great, we design things for people, not machines. And when it comes to designing for people, it's best to meet them where they are. The first step is recognizing that you have users with accessibility needs. And because you haven't explicitly accounted for those needs, you are surely excluding some portion of your user base from getting the most out of the thing you're putting out into the world. Recognizing exclusion is Microsoft's first principle of inclusive design. I like to say that good design is accessible design, and accessible design is good design. I think as designers, it's our responsibility to know how we create mismatches between our users' abilities and the products that we make. When we find these points of exclusion, it's important to see them as an opportunity for new and better solutions, creating elegance and utility for all users, not just some of them. At Zendesk, we like to say that we make beautifully simple software. We take on the burden of complexity and make difficult tasks easy for our users. When people talk about simple software, they usually talk about intuition. Intuition is the ability to understand something immediately or knowing without ever learning. I actually think that intuition is a myth. I think intuition is actually ingrained procedural memory, learned over repeated exposure to consistent patterns. I think it's muscle memory, the memory of the familiar. And in that sense, we could say that consistency is intuition. Consistency builds on prior knowledge, it maps to a user's conceptual model, and it closes the knowledge gap. The less you have to learn, the more you can focus on doing. Now, if you don't think this is important, just think back to the last time you had this frustrating experience. Doors like that put visual minimalism above simple usability. I think Laura Kahlbag has summed it up nicely in her book, Accessibility for Everyone. Usability can be compromised when designers abandon conventions because we've decided to redefine how something is normally done. Very occasionally, this can result in a new innovation that genuinely redefines and reshapes behavior, but it usually just makes a really unique mess. I think that good design is clear. When you look at a screen, you should know what you're supposed to do. It has proper affordances, meaning that the screen itself suggests interactions that can be performed with it, ideally in a way that's already recognizable by your users. I think that good design is consistent. When there's a common action, it follows the same pattern that users are already familiar with. It's consistent within the product itself, but it's also consistent with other products if the pattern is really common. That's why we all know that a forward-facing triangle is a play button, no matter what app you see it in or what device you see it on. And finally, I think that good design is inclusive. Now, inclusivity isn't just about people with disabilities. Any group that has historically had limited access can benefit from inclusion. Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, women, LGBTQ folks, the elderly, folks living in poverty, people who don't speak English, and on and on. Now, Gina, our organizer and design systems advocate extraordinaire, says that design systems are about clarity, efficiency, consistency, and beauty. That kind of matches up with some of the things I just talked about. So I think that we could add inclusivity to that definition. Now, just like great design, good content strategy, proper localization, it's best to think about and plan for accessibility as early as you can. And that's why design systems are a great place. Design systems solve repetitive challenges, whether that's what a button looks and operates like, or how to create a consistent and accessible modal experience. Design systems are the perfect vehicle for accessibility in the design and engineering world because they serve as the foundation for every designer and engineer's work. And as a bonus, design systems teams are usually small, so they can make a relatively large impact while not requiring a huge amount of monetary investment. When I was starting my accessibility education, color contrast was one of the very first things that I learned about. And in fact, the title of this talk is called Accessibility Beyond Color Contrast, which is a little tongue-in-cheek. Now, color contrast is an important aspect of accessibility, but it's just one facet. It's important, but only one of dozens of guidelines. And it's usually difficult to change because color differences tend to need to be rolled out all at once. So I suggest that as we start our accessibility journeys, we focus on things that might actually prevent someone from using our products or consuming our content. So here are a few ways that you can start without too much change to your current workflows. Now, doing this stuff alone isn't enough to transform your product, but there's small things that can add up to big differences over time. So the first thing is performance. Slow software sucks. It doesn't matter if it's a beautiful piece of software. If it's slow, it sucks. And if you don't believe me, I think we should take a look at a little company called Google. This is what they looked like in 1997. This was not a beautiful homepage, even by 1997 design standards. Over the years, they've gotten a lot better at design. And they used to brag about how fast their search results were. In fact, they actually still do, because speed's important. Now, it might be fairly straightforward to have a fast experience when all you're doing is serving text. What about if you're serving a really image-heavy application? Sometimes you just can't control how big those images are. Pinterest kind of led the pack when they introduced skeleton loading states, and now everybody does it. Users just want to be able to get through their day. The quicker they can get in, get out, the happier they'll be. When you can help them get to the thing that they need even before everything is loaded, you improve the perceived performance of the application. You might not always be able to control how heavy a page is, but you can help users with faster perceived performance. Another important aspect of perceived performance is Fitts law, which says that the time required to rapidly move to a target area is a function of the ratio between the distance to the target and the width of the target. Why does that matter? Because accuracy is hard. When you make UI bigger, you make it easier to use for people with motor function difficulties. As a bonus, bigger UI also usually means bigger type sizes, which is easier to read at a glance, but it's especially helpful for people who have low vision, like me. So which one of these do you think is easier to click? The bigger one, by a long shot, by a few tenths of a second. For someone like me who has great dexterity and mouse control, it's probably even faster if you have lower motor control. Now, a couple milliseconds here and there, a couple tenths on the other side, doesn't seem like much on an individual basis. But if you add that up over the course of a full day's work, you could end up saving your users dozens of minutes, which is important for them. So the minimum size requirements depends on the platform that you're on. Android is biggest at 48, and Microsoft is smallest at 40. Regardless of what size you're designing for, if you can make things bigger, people will feel like the UI is easier to use. Another thing that contributes to the ease of use are words. User interfaces are made up of both words and images. And depending on your interface, words could make up 75% or more. I think if you can, work with a content strategist. At Zendesk, I'm lucky to be able to partner closely with our writers on our standards. In fact, you can thank Chelsea Larson for most of the content I'm about to share. She would tell you that language provides clarity, and that good content strategy and writing can either make or break your product. So use familiar words and short sentences. Write for a lower reading level. Don't collect race information if it's not necessary for the user experience. And if you are having to write about race, make sure you capitalize the B in black. Even if your product is only available in America, don't require a first and last name. Name conventions are different across the world. Some cultures have many names, and some only have one. Likewise, if your product is going to be used in other languages, make sure your design accounts for the possibility of different sentence structures or longer characters per string. Don't use the generic he. Use plural pronouns instead, like they. Don't use the generic man. Say individual, person, or human. Humankind, not mankind. Don't call attention to someone's gender when it's irrelevant. If Caleb is a nurse, just call him a nurse, not a male nurse. And don't collect gender or sex information, again, unless it's absolutely important for a user experience. And if you have to collect it, let people self-identify. Including a third option of other doesn't count. It's also important not to use words for legitimate medical conditions to describe personal tendencies. Liking a clean home doesn't make someone OCD. Don't use phrases that you've heard on the playground or in elementary school. And also, don't skirt around saying disabled. Euphemisms like handy-capable or differently abled can be insulting. When it comes to the UI, screen readers have no concept of left or right or above and below. You'll also want to avoid telling people how to use the UI, like saying click here. Clicking doesn't happen on mobile devices, and people using their keyboards don't click either. Avoid using language like learn more for CTAs and links. Someone using a screen reader and tabbing through could end up just hearing a succession of learn more, learn more, learn more, learn more, and have no idea what they might want to be learning more about. Use specific language to ensure that people have as much context about your content as possible. And finally, don't use placeholders for labels or instructions. Screen readers often skip over placeholder text, and some sighted users can't see it because the color contrast is poor. And if the color contrast is too good, other sighted users might mistake the form as being already filled out. So seriously, everything should get a label. Text inputs, menus and drop-downs, checkboxes, radios, buttons, all of it. Now, a picture can paint 1,000 words, but don't let that deter you from properly describing a picture for a user who relies on assistive technology. Take icons. Icons stand for concepts. Without a label, an envelope icon is just an envelope. But with a label, suddenly it means email guests. When it comes to actual images, every image should get an alt attribute. And depending on what purpose the image is serving, you might change how you describe it. Every image should get an alt attribute. Depending on the purpose of the image, you might change how you describe it. If the image is purely decorative, just use an empty alt. If it's a reaction GIF, maybe just say impressed Ron Burgundy. But if it's a scholarly article on the importance of Anchorman in American cinema, then maybe you go a little bit deeper. Sure, there are a number of ways to circumvent the need for an alt attribute on every image itself. But here's an example of when things go wrong. This is a vacation rental site. After enabling voiceover, I navigated to this image that was wrapped in an A tag. Here's what a user relying on assistive technology would hear.
Link /3AF34032-1769-4881-95B5-ED7ECC2224.JPEG question T equals C:\W400-H267 $W400-H267-SFID-50:FJPG-C75 October 2018 Sherwood 1 Reservation.
That's over 14 seconds of random letters and numbers at a speaking rate of over 200 words per minute. Imagine if the reservation card you wanted was buried between several others, but you weren't sure exactly where. A simple addition of an empty alt tag would have allowed the screen reader to simply read October 2018, Sherwood 1 Reservation. If you're providing video as part of your experience, include captions, or even better, transcripts if you can. What about user-generated content, though? Well, maybe one day AI will be smart enough to understand the context and intention around the images and the text and video that we put down. But in the meantime, give your users the ability to add their own. In real life, some users already add this information to their captions, but it's best if you actually let them provide alt text. And most importantly, keep learning. Don't let this talk be the only education you get about accessibility. There's so many things to learn, like how blind people use their phones, design and color theory, and front-end best practices. Talk about this stuff with your colleagues. Bring it up in your critiques and your code reviews. And don't shy away from hard questions. Like, have we conducted any research with users who are 20 years older than our target demographic? How would this copy read to someone who hasn't graduated high school? In what ways might this design open up women or people of color to additional abuse? How might a user without vision accomplish this task? Can someone with a slower internet connection use this in a meaningful way? Good design is accessible design. When you work that into your design systems, it can make its way all throughout your products. There's so many ways, big and small, that we can make our products better every day. And when we make our products more accessible and more inclusive, everyone benefits. Our products become easier to use for everyone. Including accessibility within the foundations of your design system allows you to avoid situations like this, where accessibility was clearly an afterthought, and instead delight your users with integrated accessibility patterns, like this path for the blind that is literally built into the streets of Copenhagen. Go forth and be an ally. Thank you.
Allison, thank you so much for that great talk. There are so many things from that talk that I would love your perspective on. The first one is, why do you think that eggs don't tell jokes?
Don't know.
It's because they crack each other up.
Love a good dad joke.
All right. On a more serious note, the talk, and you mentioned this in the talk is called Accessibility Beyond Color Contrast. And so I'm going to make a couple of assumptions just from that title on its own, which is that likely you probably encounter people who think accessibility is sort of like equal to, oh, it's a color contrast thing. And once we fix that, we've done all the accessibility things. What are some of the other things that you've seen designers assume or developers assume? And maybe tell us a little bit about why you wrote this particular talk and you know, what you see designers where they're limited in their accessibility knowledge and what this talk could be helpful at.
Yeah, so definitely color contrast, I think, is one of those first things that we get exposed to when it comes to accessibility. And it's certainly one of the easiest to understand, right? If you can't see something, if the contrast is not high enough, you're gonna have a hard time actually perceiving it. But there are so many things that can actually get in the way before a web page even displays on a browser that it's important to be mindful of. And some of them are related to engineering. Some of them are still related to, you know, the words that we use or the design that we choose to pursue. But every single one of those elements is essential in delivering an accessible experience. You can't have a truly, you know, accessible design that has great color contrast, really big controls, if the words don't make sense, or if it takes, you know, 30 seconds to load, or if it's not responsive to the way that you're actually trying to use it. So there's so many different things. It's almost, I actually had a really hard time narrowing down what I wanted to include. You know, some of the things that I had kind of had in this big brainstorm list were like, when you put a modal, you know, a modal that maybe displays a photo light show, or if you work on a site where you're trying to capture an email address when someone first comes onto the site, modals need to actually capture the browser's focus so that a user who's in a screen reader or using keyboard only can actually navigate the controls for that form, or, you know, be able to operate the button to close it out. Things like, I actually saw in the chat there was talk about closed captioning, and we've made a lot of progress in automatic closed captioning. That's really fantastic. But one of the things that you see with that automatic closed captioning is that if someone were to include a swear word, oftentimes that intentionally gets bleeped out. And they just don't include the word, which provides a different experience to someone who has to read the content versus hear the content. And you can make plenty of arguments whether that's good or whether that's bad, but it doesn't provide an equal experience. And is that really the way that you want to portray the content?
Yeah, interesting. One of the things that I see a lot of teams doing is that they like accessibility as a compliance thing, right? Because it's easy, because it's a checklist, right? I either did this thing or I didn't. I think that's probably why color contrast is a thing that's so popular. It's like you can look at it on a scale, you can measure it, and then you can say, I did pass or I didn't pass. So one of the things that you had mentioned in your talk is like making things bigger. And that one's tougher, because what do you say to the people, your product owner or somebody like that, or even a user or a customer, that you make something bigger in order to make it more accessible, and they go, oh, it's too big, I hate this, I don't like this. Like, it starts to get into that subjective territory. How do you handle that? How do you have conversations about things like that?
Yeah, this is actually something. I work at Zendesk. We make customer service software. And so we have, our primary users are customer service agents, and they really like to have a lot of density of information on the screen. They want to have all of the information about a customer and not have to be, swapping between different monitors or doing a lot of, changing of their interface while they're trying to answer a question. And it really is, I think this is, one of those places where it really is a balance. But what you can find when you actually do user testing with these things is how quickly is someone actually accomplishing their task. And it is almost invariably faster to have bigger UI, even with the addition of scrolling or whatever. Because when you, especially right with with enterprise type software, where you've got power users, and power users they develop their own shortcuts, everything. People like that are going to use the keyboard to navigate. And if you've got a good tab order, it almost doesn't matter where something is on the screen, because you're going to develop a muscle memory around, okay, I know I have to tap 3 times to get to that control, done. It doesn't matter. But for a user who is sighted, having it be bigger, having it be, easier to manipulate the mouse over to, really does become this big usability win. So it does come down to another way of evaluating it with numbers that can really help people who maybe don't see the value in it right away.
Yeah, gotcha. Related to the muscle memory thing, you said something that's, I don't know, maybe hashtag hot drama a little bit here. You said you think intuition is a myth.
Yes.
And you related it more to consistency. Can you talk a little bit about that? Where does that belief come from? Because there's a big rhetoric with designers that we got to build intuitive interfaces and things that people know how to use automatically without learning it. So I could see how that could ruffle some feathers. Where did that opinion come from your side?
Well, I think that there's not a lot of things that humans are actually very intuitive about. We base our intuition on the way that we feel. Intuition is a real feeling kind of human thing. And the way that you develop that feeling is to have exposure to that kind of over and over again. And so for me, it's that almost is certainly what intuition is. It's not I magically know how to use this door handle. I know how to use the door handle because it looks like I should be able to grab onto that thing. It has the proper physical affordance for it. Physical affordances are present everywhere in the physical world. It's actually, that's what makes it easy to move around as a human. But they're less present in the digital world. And the things that we think of as being kind of, oh, they were always there, right? Like a text box or a button. We know that those things are text boxes and buttons because a text box is going to have a gray box around it. And when you put your cursor in it, it's going to start blinking and there's going to be a blue ring around it. So we've learned that over time and through repeated exposure to these things, which is why, human interface guidelines like Apple or Android or Material, all of those things are really important because those are the things that are intuition because we've been exposed to them for so long.
Got it. That makes sense. There's some great questions in the chat here. I'm going to read a couple of those out. Jay has a great question for you, which is how often or closely do you work with UX researchers to ensure the best user experience, and how much collaboration is there versus kind of independent work?
Yeah, I think research is just an absolutely essential part of the design process, and especially when it comes to accessibility. So much of accessibility is really around understanding the interface. And that's really where the most research can help. Do users understand these concepts? Are the words that are in the UI making sense to them? Do they go where they're expecting to go when they click on this thing? All of that. But it also is important to do that upfront research. What kinds of users do we have? Do we have an understanding that we have a lot of power users, and so keyboard navigation is very important. So you've got power users, you also got screen readers who need that. And understanding those needs up front lets you account for all of this stuff as it's actually being designed, rather than having to go back and say, oh, we got to remediate this, and we're going to have to shoehorn accessibility into this experience now.
There are two related questions to that too. So that's kind of a good note to kind of carry it forward. I'm going to combine these two. The questions are from Eric and from Claudia about working with other teams and other people up in relation to accessibility. So one example is, how do you convince stakeholders to invest in accessibility and more inclusive designs, rather than the mitigation, rather than like, well, we're going to get sued if we don't invest in this, like kind of the fear-based, incentive. And then related, how do you have tips for working with SEO, kind of the SEO side of the business, where text quantity and all that kind of stuff comes in? How do you work with other teams, in that way?
Yeah. So when it comes to convincing business owners, your approach is going to have to change depending on whatever company you work at, right? Every company has different business needs that it needs to address. But for me, one of the most compelling things about accessibility is that roughly 15 to 20% of the population experiences some kind of permanent disability. And then, of course, there are temporary disabilities or situational disabilities. But if you can unlock an experience for 15 to 20% of an audience group, you're automatically going to expose yourself to greater possibilities for customers, for income, for all of that. So it's a really great business opportunity. And it's often also a way for businesses to really kind of walk their values. A lot of companies will say, we're here for everybody. We want everybody to have a great experience. This is a way to really live that out, and to prove that you really mean what you're saying when it comes to a lot of the inclusion statements that we're seeing a lot of companies put out these days. Now, when it comes to the other side of the business, how do you work with SEO, and how do you work with just different teams across your company? Again, it is like tailoring your reasoning for them. It's definitely true that when you create accessible websites, it's actually better for SEO because you're going to have more relevant content. You're going to be using proper semantics. And that's the kind of thing that, the Google bots really makes it easy for them to traverse that content. And so it can actually help your actually help your SEO.
Got it. There's a lot of questions in the chat around specific things like character counts and things like that. I'm going to lump them all kind of into one and into a couple, which is that a lot of people are asking about tools and resources. You sort of ended your talk with saying, like, don't let this be the last thing that you hear about accessibility, which is awesome advice that seemed to resonate with a lot of people. So I think a lot of people are saying, like, okay, what can we do next? Where do we go? What can we read? Do you have tools, resources, recommendations for things like that? Definitely.
So I've read a couple books that I think are really great kind of primers on disability and accessibility. Laura Kahlbag's book, which I referenced in my talk, Accessibility is for Everyone, is a really great book. It's like maybe a 2-day read, and it's just chock full of really fantastic examples and how-tos. So that's a really great primer there. And then a book called Mismatched by Kat Holmes, who worked at Microsoft, is another really excellent book on disability. And then just quickly in terms of like, oh, I want to actually get started on my site. I want to get this worked into my product. Just going to Google WCAG and go and actually read through the guidelines that the Accessibility Initiative has put out. Dig into them, look at the criteria, look at how they define success, and start to think about how can you bring that into your own work? What might have to change in order for that to be brought into your work?
Awesome. Let's do maybe two more and then we'll kind of wrap up here. So let's tie it back to design systems specifically. What does an accessible design system actually mean, and what does that look like? There's a narrative around accessible design systems that just because you have accessible components doesn't necessarily mean that you have an accessible design system. I'm sure you've got some opinions and experience about that. What can you tell us about what accessibility within a design system context looks like, and what does that mean?
Yeah. So, again, I think if design systems help provide the building blocks for web interfaces or application interfaces, including accessibility features within those components is that first step. But in order to actually leverage an accessible design system, you also have to be able, the people who are using it need to understand, okay, I know it has these features, how do I use them properly? And so in that sense, making sure that your design system documentation is up to date, that, when you have your office hours, you're talking about that stuff, you make yourselves available to kind of spread that knowledge. And the more that happens, the more you're actually going to, develop advocates for it. And people who will say, actually, this really resonates with me. I want to keep pursuing it. And you'll be able to, within your organizations, create kind of a grounds up movement a little bit.
Got it. Last question. We'll kind of wrap up with this one. Like interacting in the chat with a few people during your talk, and one of the things that you said was, the WCAG is anything but quick. So it's a good resource. It's dense. It's like reading the encyclopedia, which is useful and informative, but not necessarily riveting. What are some things that I haven't asked you about accessibility yet that could help people get started in an actionable way? I mean, you mentioned some tools and resources already. What are some things that I haven't asked you about accessibility that I should have asked you about accessibility?
Well, I think, the one of the hardest things is people just feel like they don't know anybody who needs this stuff. They don't know what the needs are. They don't know how to begin addressing them. And I think it's really important to remember, I said around 15 to 20% of the population experiences some kind of disability. Start thinking a little bit more about what it might be like for that 15 to 20%. There's a reason why we don't know that we know people who have disabilities. There's a lot of ableism in our society. And so if we can start to think a little bit more deeply about how that might feel and what ways that might affect someone's life, we can start to, get a little bit more in touch with what could we do and how might it change our work. I think everything starts with a conversation. I think accessibility is everybody's responsibility. I don't think it's just for a product manager. I don't think it's just for an engineer. I don't think it's just for a designer, just for a writer. That whole team needs to be able to have a conversation about what is it going to be like for someone using a screen reader to try and use our application. Are they going to be able to? They might not. And if they can't, what are some ways that we can start to fix that together?